It's way beyond a pleasure, honour and privilege to introduce Dan. Dr. Daniel Hulme is a leading expert in AI and emerging technology. He's the CEO of Satalia, an award-winning and visionary company that provides AI solutions to global companies, including Tesco and PwC. He has a PhD in AI from UCL, where he's computer science engineer in residence. He's a lecturer in AI at the London School of Economics Marshall Institute. He's a serial speaker for Google and an undisputed king of TED Talks. He holds an international Kauffman Global Entrepreneur Scholarship and is a faculty member of Singularity University. He holds numerous corporate and governmental advisory positions. Please welcome the amazing Daniel Hulme.
Oh, wow. I can go now. That's the best introduction I've ever had. I'm going to say those infinite words, which is, can you see my screen? First of all, can you see my screen? Excellent, fantastic. And unfortunately, I'm going to disappoint everybody because I'm going to raise more questions than I have answers. But I'm hoping that the panelists are going to be able to help answer some of those questions I'm going to raise in today's talk. So I'm not going to introduce myself because I don't think I could do a better job than what was just done. But I do two or three things. One is I have an academic hat where I'm now entrepreneur in residence for UCL, so I help them figure out how to take deep tech and spin it out. And I'm the CEO of a company called Satalia, which is about 100 people, and we build AI solutions for big companies. And I get the privilege to historically travel around the world, but now from my own home to try and inspire leaders, future leaders, about thinking about the impact of technology on society and maybe even doing something about it. So this talk is going to be split into three parts. The first part is going to be talking about AI, and the second part will be talking about innovation and leadership. And finally, we'll talk about the end of the world, which is my favorite topic. I think that save up plenty of questions for the panelists. They've got an incredible wealth of experience between them, and I'm sure that we'll be able to answer many of your questions. Ordinarily, what I would do is I would take people through this stack to understand data-driven decision making. I don't have time, unfortunately, in this talk to go through this stack, but there are amazing parallels between how we build systems to make decisions and how humans make decisions. And one of the books I'm sure that many people has read on the call is a book by a Nobel Prize winning economist called Daniel Kahneman. He wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, and he argues that we have two brains. We have a fast brain and a slow brain, and as I said, there are many parallels between those types of brains with also AI, and there are implications of having fast brains and slow brains in AI that I'll talk more about later on. But I just wanted to kind of highlight what these fast and slow brains are before I go on. And I'm going to ask you all some maths questions, and your job is to answer these maths questions as fast as possible. That's your job. If you don't answer them faster than your competitors, they're going to take your market. So the first question, nice and easy, and you can answer it in your head or on chat, it's up to you. First question, what's 2 times 2? I'm sure that everybody knows the answer to that. It's 4, good. What's 14 times 768? That's where you need to use your slow brain. So the first one, you're using your fast brain. The second one, you need to use a slow brain. You need to use an algorithm to try and determine what the answer is. Let me ask you another maths question. And again, many of you have probably heard this before, particularly if you've read the book. The combined price of a bat and a ball is £1.10. The bat is £1 more than the ball. How much is the ball? The combined price is £1.10. The bat is £1 more than the ball. How much is the ball? If you knew the answer already, then you'll know that it's 5 pence. Many of you will be thinking 10 pence. It's not. The ball is £1. The bat is £1 and 5 pence, and the ball is 5 pence. The combined price is £1 and 10 pence. This is where, again, we use our fast brain to try and make a decision, and we get it wrong. And AI at the moment is essentially a fast brain. We give it data, it goes through some sort of model, and sometimes it gets it wrong, and that has ethical and other implications I'm going to talk about later on. Let me ask you another maths question. So I've got 5 staff members here. Maybe you can recognize yourself in these 5 staff members. We know their skills, we know their preferences. What we want to do is we want to allocate these 5 resources, these 5 staff members, to 5 jobs. Now, I wonder if anybody can tell me how many ways can I allocate 5 people to 5 jobs? 5. We're looking at one allocation now. I can flip 2 around to get another allocation. I can flip another 2 around to get another combination. How many possible ways can I allocate 5 people to 5 jobs? I wonder if anybody knows. I can't see the chat. I'm just going to open this up. It's, if you remember the exclamation mark from school, it's 5 times 4 times 3, exactly 5 factorial. So there's 120 possible ways that I can allocate 5 people to 5 jobs. Let's make the problem a bit more complicated. I've got now 15 staff members I want to allocate to jobs, and don't say 15 factorial, but can anybody tell me how many ways can I allocate 15 people to 15 jobs? I wonder if anybody, just use your fast brain. It's a big number. It's over 1 trillion possible combinations. So there are over 1 trillion ways I can allocate 15 people to 15 jobs. One rule to take away with you today: anything more than 7, don't use a human for. Humans can solve problems up to about 7 allocations of people to jobs, or delivering packages, or figuring out how many where to spend your marketing money. But anything beyond 7, we're pretty useless. And actually, industry don't have problems of this size, they have problems of this size. So here are 500 staff members. Can anybody tell me how many ways can I allocate 500 staff members? No, you can't. It's a big number. It's a number that's got over 1,000 digits. And just to put this number into context, this is how many atoms there are in the universe. So when you reach about 60 things that you need to consider, again, 60 marketing channels or 60 people to allocate to tasks, there are more possible ways of allocating those resources than there are atoms in the universe. Humans can solve problems up to 7. We can get a good computer scientist that can probably solve problems up to about 25. Beyond that, we're pretty useless. And one of my clients is PwC. They have 5,000 auditors that they need to allocate to jobs. 5,000 factorial is not a number we can even imagine. And again, industry is solving these problems usually using people, and we're solving them badly. The reason why I highlight that is because when we think about technology is broken up now into these kind of 3 parts. The first part is data, and everybody's going on their digital transformation. They're trying to bring their data together because they know that there's lots of interesting insights in that data. And so everybody's excited about this middle part, which is hiring data scientists, machine learning experts to try and find patterns from our data that help us make decisions. Now, it turns out that decision making is a very different set of skills to finding patterns in data. And one of the first concerns I have is industry are hiring lots of data scientists, people have machine learning skills, that actually are not suited to solving these types of problems. These types of problems are called optimization problems. There's a whole different field in computer science to solve these problems. And my worry is that companies are hiring the wrong type of people to solve the wrong problems. In fact, I would argue that companies don't have machine learning problems, they have decision problems. And decision making, as I said, is a completely different field in computer science. It's using insights, it's using machine learning, but ultimately you have a decision to make. And then when we talk about decision making, it also then starts to bring up safety and ethical issues that I'm going to talk about in a moment. So whenever if you touch this technology stack, you're probably calling yourself an AI company. And I think that that's wrong. I think that if you build a system that you give data to and it makes a decision, and tomorrow you give it the same data, it makes the same decision, what you have is automation. It's doing the same thing over again. Now, the definition of stupidity is doing the same thing over again and expecting a different answer. But by definition, automation is stupid. And so by definition, automation is not AI. And actually, there are 2 definitions of AI that I think is important for everybody to understand. The first definition is more popular, but I think is weak, which is getting computers to do things that humans can do. So over the past decade, we've managed to get machines to do things that traditionally were only in the domain of human beings. We've managed to get machines to recognize objects and images, to correspond in natural language. And because humans are the most intelligent thing we know in the universe, when we get machines to do things...
Oui, ça va. Écoute,
when we get machines to do things that humans can do, we then assume that that's intelligence. Now, again, I would argue that humans are very good at solving problems up to about 7. We're very good at finding patterns in about 4 dimensions. Computers can solve problems with thousands of moving parts, and they can find patterns in thousands of dimensions. So benchmarking machines against humans is a very silly thing to do. There's actually a much better definition of AI that comes from the definition of intelligence, which is goal-directed adaptive behavior. Goal-directed in the sense we're trying to achieve an objective. We're trying to allocate our staff to maximize our utilization, or we're trying to put money into marketing channels to maximize our reach. We have to have a goal. Behavior is how quickly can I allocate my resources to achieve that goal. But the key word for me in this definition is the word adaptive. Ultimately, what we want to do is build systems that make decisions, learn about whether those decisions are good or bad, adapt their own understanding of the world so that tomorrow they can make better decisions. And if I was being brutally honest, I haven't seen a single successful complex adaptive system in production in my life. So actually, I would argue that nobody's really doing AI according to this definition. Just to give you a little bit of history, AI in the 60s and 70s was looked like this. This is Socrates before he drinks hemlock. So Socrates is famous for inspiring the Socratic method. So if I say Socrates is a man and all men are mortal, we can infer that Socrates is mortal. And AI in the early days was writing down these rules and then trying to infer new knowledge from these rules, and it never really scaled. And in the 80s and 90s, a new type of AI came along that was modeled on how biology learns and makes decisions. Now, this is the brain of a bumblebee. Bumblebees have 1 million neurons. Their brain can fit on the end of a needle. Humans have about 84 billion neurons. And my PhD was originally trying to model the brain of a bumblebee. So I was trying to figure out how can you model 1 million neurons in a machine and have machines then do things that bumblebees do, navigate 3D worlds, talk to each other, solve problems. They don't handle Windows very well, but ultimately they're very, very smart creatures. And 15 years ago, it was impossible to model 1 million neurons in a machine. But over the past decade, actually, we've managed to now to model brains that have hundreds of millions of neurons. Deep learning and other technologies allow us to now model big brains, and we can teach these brains to do things that traditionally only human beings can do. So we can teach these brains to recognize objects in images, correspond in natural language. Now, these brains are very good at finding patterns from data, but they are not good at making decisions. I actually think that the near future is combining these types of technologies, extracting insights from data, with these types of technologies that are then reasoning and making decisions with those insights. And then what we need to do is build systems that adapt themselves in production, which is even more difficult. So just to give you a different flavor of AI as well, if this semicircle here was the bounds of human endeavor, I would probably argue we can take any specific task that a human does, whether it's a decision-making task or a insight extraction task, and we can probably build an AI that can outperform us significantly or almost any specific task. Now, it's very inefficient and costly to build these individual systems and glue them all together. So there's lots of research going into what is called artificial general intelligence, and this is why humans are special. We are one system that can do many things, and so there's lots of interesting research going into how do we build brains that don't just do one thing, but that can actually do many things. And if we take this to its extreme, its logical conclusion, it's predicted that within our lifetime we are going to build a brain that is smarter than us in every single possible way. I'm sure that many of you have heard this before. It's often referred to as superintelligence or the singularity, and it is the last invention that humanity will create. And we don't know if it's going to be the most glorious thing that happens to us or the biggest existential threat. I actually think it's our biggest existential threat. And I'm trying to figure out how do we mitigate this risk, but this is likely to happen within our lifetime. I won't bore you with this. We can talk about this in the Q&A. Now, when it comes to building intelligence, before we reach superintelligence, we're having to build systems that are making decisions about our everyday lives. And I'm sure that you're all tired of hearing about the trolley problem. I'm in my driverless car. Do I kill a kid? Do I kill a driver? Do I kill somebody else? We are actually having to build these decisions into the systems that we're creating. But I want to give you a question to ponder while I'm going through this presentation. And the question is this: imagine you are sitting on the ethics committee of a ride sharing or ride hailing company like an Uber or a Lyft, and you've just deployed an AI that is trying to understand how to price the surge pricing to maximize profit. So you put this AI into production, and what the AI realizes over time is that when people's battery is very low, they're willing to spend a lot more money on their ride. And so what it's doing is essentially it's identified and it's exploiting a vulnerability in humans. This is not about supply and demand. This is saying that this person is about to run out of battery, and if I price this higher, they're going to be desperate enough to pay for it. Now you're sitting on the ethics committee. Do you decide to keep that into production, or do you decide to take it out of production? It's achieving its goal, it's maximizing the revenues, but it's also exploiting a vulnerability in human beings. What do you do as sitting on the ethics committee? I just want you to think about that as we go through this. So when we build AI systems, actually, there are various different perspectives that we have to look at in terms of building safe, ethical systems. And these, as far as I'm concerned, are the 4 categories that we need to be concerning ourselves that are raised because of AI. Now, we already have well-established ethics committees. We already have a well-established ways of testing complex systems. And the question that we have to ask ourselves is, what is it about AI that makes this stuff different? What is it about AI that makes ethical conversations different, safety questions different, governance questions different? And one might argue that it doesn't. That actually all that AI does is raise questions around where we have to expand our repertoire, our ethical thinking. It's not a separate subject. We have to have a separate group of people thinking about this. It's actually just an expansion of ethics, and that's a question that I think I'm yet to solve, and I'm sure that the panelists have some ideas about how to answer that question. So when I'm thinking about AI and its impact on organizations, on society, I think about these 4 things, and I won't go into the detail because I'm sure that many of these words are familiar with you all. But when I think about AI safety, I'm asking myself, are these systems transparent? Are there biases? Can we explain how these systems are making their decisions? Can we explain how they are coming to their insights? And can we audit the decisions that are being made so we can go back and we can identify where it's failed? For me, the question around ethics is not about transparency and bias and explainability, and I think unfortunately we confuse the two. The question for me around ethics is around intent. What is our intent as an organization? Is it to maximize profits, which is a perfectly reasonable intent? But setting those objectives then for the AI to achieve that intent could have adverse effects, like I described in the ride sharing company. So what is the impact of where it will go wrong? And then for me, those questions are ethical questions. It's not about bias. It's not about transparency. It's about intent. And maybe again, I'll talk more about this later on. So we hear a lot of popular opinion about AI safety, AI ethics, AI governance. And I'm a little bit nervous that we might be getting seduced by marketing hype, as opposed to listening to the people that really understand how to build these systems and what the impact is if we get them wrong. So I'm going to move on actually now. Now we've talked a little bit about AI. I'm going to talk about how AI and technology is going to affect organizations and actually use this as an opportunity to raise some ethical questions. So I won't talk about this, is actually not so important, but ultimately we're not only trying to build systems that are adapting more quickly to a changing world, because that's how you win. We also need to build organizations that adapt more quickly to a changing world. In fact, actually, I would argue that this technology stack that I've been through, that I've talked about, is actually going to become a commodity over the next 10 years. I think that we all have access now to very cheap compute. We have access to lots of free data. All of the tools you need to build million neuron brains, to find patterns in data, it's all free, it's all open source. At some point, somebody will commoditize decision making and somebody will commoditize self-learning. The battleground for companies is not technology, it's talent. How do we attract, motivate, inspire talent to innovate? Actually, Steve Jobs has a really good definition of innovation. He said, innovation is creativity that ships. The most important word for me in that definition is the word that. That is the process of generating ideas and getting them to the point where somebody's willing to pay for it or where it's adding value. And this is not a technological question. This is how do you motivate, inspire your workforce to innovate, and how do you enable them to innovate? And there's lots of work that's been done on motivation. There's a very good introductory book by a guy called Dan Pink. It's called Drive. And he said there are 3 things that motivate people: autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Autonomy is giving people the freedom to do what they want, and mastery is giving them the ability to become really good at what they want, and purpose is giving them something higher to align themselves with. I'm going to talk about now some of the trends that we're seeing in organizations, how we're changing the nature of organizations, and how AI and technology is enabling that, and some of the challenges that we're going to have to face into. So there's a very good website and book by an organization called Corporate Rebels, and what they've done is they've categorized these trends that we're seeing in leadership, in organizations, in these 8 categories. And what I want to do is I want to talk through each one quickly and highlight some of the interesting ethical challenges that we might be facing because of technology. Now, the first one, the moving from profit-orientated organizations to more purposeful organizations, is less to do with technology and it's more to do with culture. Interestingly, if you go and Google the values of organizations, what you'll do is you'll come to this website very quickly. Can you see the website that I'm highlighting? Just out of curiosity, yeah. So this is where somebody's gathered together lots of values of lots of different companies. So if you look through them, you've got Accenture here, you've got integrity, you've got Adidas that's got integrity, you've got, I don't know, American Express integrity, you've got Barnes and Noble integrity. You get the point. The point is that these companies have spent millions of pounds on figuring out what their values are, and they're all the same. And this is interesting, actually, because I wonder if anybody can tell me who these values are: respect, integrity, communication, and excellence. Does anybody know whose values they are? Is Enron's values. So you can have the best values in the world. If you don't create an organizational structure, processes that enable these values to emerge, then you're wasting your time. So I actually don't care about values. I care about how do you design systems, how do you design processes, structures, organizations to allow for innovation, but also to mitigate some of the toxicities around this stuff. I won't bore you with the details, but one of the things that I'm going to do over the next couple of years is I'm going to use AI to scour all of the different corpuses of text around, I don't know, religious texts, philosophical texts, other ideologies, and see if there are any ethical pillars that we all agree on. Now, actually, I believe that there are. I've highlighted some of them here. But what would be amazing is if we could get AI to look across all of these corpuses of human knowledge and say, these are the 4 things that we all agree on, and then use that as a framework that we can then measure AI against. AI could help us understand the ethical framework for humanity, and then we could build AIs to make sure that they're aligned with that framework. That's something I'm really interested in trying to tackle over the next couple of years. So we're also moving from hierarchical structures to teams. I'm sure that you all work in many organizations, and I'm sure that you recognize some of the interesting relationships that exist in hierarchical structures. Hierarchical structures, for me, are not structures that allow for innovation. They allow for toxicity, psychological unsafety. What we're seeing are companies moving from these types of structures to moving towards flatter structures. So we're seeing new types of technologies, new types of organizational methodologies that allow us to remove middle managers. I still believe that flat structures are broken. I'm actually interested in creating completely decentralized structures. And what I mean by that is I've got 100 people in my company. We have no fixed managers, no fixed KPIs, no fixed hierarchies. We operate very much like a swarm. Where AI is enabling us to understand our skills, our relationships, who should be making what decisions. And my goal is to not just to scale this to 1,000 people or 100,000 people. My goal is to scale this to a planet. I want to try and create a planet where everybody's free to contribute to whatever they want and be fairly remunerated for that contribution. A world that doesn't have companies, a world that doesn't have countries. So that's my 30-year plan for humanity. We are seeing this happen in organizations, but it's taking a little bit of time. We're also seeing a movement from directive leadership to now facilitating supportive leadership. Now, if you Google what makes a good leader, you see these infographics that say this is what bosses are like and this is what leaders are like. And I would ask anybody, do you know anybody that actually captures all of these different characteristics? And I think you'll be hard pressed to do that. What I would think that we could do with AI is identify in our informal network who are great coaches, who are great at giving praise, who are great at people that you can talk to, who are great at, I don't know, motivating you, and to decentralize and granularize leadership and allow AI to empower those people to contribute positively to the organization. So not to expect one person to have all of those characteristics. I also believe that we can use AI to separate powers of control. Again, I won't bore you with some of those details, but most hierarchical organizations, the people at the top are able to make decisions and mark their own homework. And I think that AI will actually enable us to separate those powers of control to make organizations much more effective. So one of the things that I do in my company is I use AI to look at our digital footprint to understand what skills people have, what relationships they have with each other. So I can, for example, look at my network, my digital twin. I can say, if Darius leaves the organization, I get now a silo between two parts of my company. Now, this actually does raise lots of interesting ethical questions. I can identify people in my company who are going to leave before they know they're going to leave. I can identify secret lovers in my company. The people that have access and power to this information, to these insights, also have a lot of power, and we have to face into that as well. The other one, we're moving from a plan and predict to experiment and adapt, and I think that has been clear. These types of hierarchical structures are not conducive for adaptation. Remember, adaptation is synonymous with intelligent. The more adaptive you are, the more intelligent you are. So what we've seen is organizations bringing new structures like agile and whatnot, and lean structures, new design principles, which brings in complexity to the organization. But the purpose of this is that it empowers teams to decide their own workload, and it also creates more adaptive type structures, again enabled through technology. Again, people will call it AI, it's not, it's analytics, but ultimately we're using these technologies to try to make more adaptive organizations. And ultimately what we're trying to do is create digital twins of our companies. Again, I won't bore you with this, but when I go back to my diagram over here, this is a digital twin of Satalia. I can run scenarios. I can say, if this person leaves, what will happen? I can say what would happen if we hired this person. And I think that what we're going to do is move towards this concept of a digital twin. And this is going to be enabled through COVID. So all of the stuff that we're creating on emails, on Slack, on Zoom will be captured, and that will help us understand relationships, skills, career development, all that good stuff. We also are moving from a rules to more freedom and trust. Now, the reason why I want to highlight this is because I don't believe in using technology just for the sake of using technology. There's a lot of concern at the moment around diversity and inclusion, around well-being, around psychological safety. And the thing why I want to highlight here, which I'm not sure if everybody is aware of, is that if you've got kids or a therapist, one of the things that you'll learn about is a concept called attachment theory. And attachment theory is essentially a psychological theory where how you form and maintain relationships as an adult is typically highly dependent upon how your parents behave towards you as an infant, before you're even conscious. And again, I used to think this was nonsense, but when you start to learn about it, you realize that these frameworks actually hold a lot of truth. 60% of the population are apparently dysfunctional at forming and maintaining relationships. If you've been neglected as an infant, you'll most likely form a dismissive and or avoidant attachment style. If your parents have been very hot and cold, maybe they're going for a divorce, sometimes they were there for you, sometimes not, you'll develop what is called an anxious attachment style, where you get jealous very quickly, you don't know what to do to make people love you. 60% of people of the population are dysfunctional at forming and maintaining relationships, and I would argue that these hierarchical structures are breeding grounds for psychological unsafety. And when building, when using technology, when coming up with new organizational structures, we have to always take into account the human psychology, and I wanted to highlight that. So the other trend that we're seeing is the trend from centralized authority to distributed decision making. One of the crazy things that we used to do in Satalia in my company is ask everybody every year to make public recommendations for their salary. So you would all publicly declare what you want to be paid, and then what would happen is people would vote on whether their salaries should be increased or decreased or kept the same. And we would use AI to determine how many votes one person has for another. So if I've worked very closely with you over the past year, if I'm very knowledgeable about your domain, I will have more votes for your salary than somebody else. So what we're doing here is we're trying to use AI to augment human decision making with artificial decision making. The AI is giving you the votes, but you are the one that's making the decision. And this has surfaced quite a lot of interesting insights. First of all, females tend to undervalue themselves. I won't go into the details here, but we had a female that would make a recommendation for her salary, and the crowd would say, "What are you talking about? Go away and increase it. You're worth way more than that." So what this did is it highlighted the bias in her undervaluing herself. And what it did, it mitigated the bias because we crowdsourced that opinion. I actually believe that we can make many decisions in our organizations using this weighted democracy enabled by AI. And of course, it's subject to bias. Of course, it's subject to corruption. But you have to ask yourself, is it better than the alternative? Is it better than having a manager that has a myopic view over your activities and also have a budget that then rubs their hands together because you're not asking for a bigger salary than what you deserve? So that's what you have to ask yourself. Is it better than the alternative? I won't go into the details here. So I'm very, very near the end of the presentation. We're also moving towards a secrecy to radical transparency. So more and more information is becoming available to people. In some respects, this is paralyzing for organizations. So we used to have transparent salaries, and we still do as much as we can. We have analytics that help people understand what they're doing, what they're working on, where they could work, their career development, all that kind of stuff. The hypothesis is by giving more people more information, they can make better decisions. In reality, it can be paralyzing, it can be confusing, it can even produce a lack of trust for leadership. And this is a subject I could talk about for hours. I don't have time, but this is a really important challenge. And finally, I imagine a world where we are not just one job description. We're not just a software engineer, but we are somebody that has many, many different talents. Now, I won't bore you with this. This is not important. But we are today a software engineer, tomorrow a photographer, and the next day a project manager. How do we organize our structures in a way that allows people to have a diverse portfolio of career? Because at the moment, our legislative systems, our organizational systems don't allow people to have that freedom. And again, I believe that this is going to be enabled by AI. But it will raise questions about how do you set job titles, how do you remunerate people if you are a hybrid role. And again, I believe that these are going to be solved by AI, but they're big problems to solve. Again, I'm happy to talk about this. I'm just going to close in the last 2 minutes to talk about the future. I hope that I've kind of convinced you that maybe on the one hand, there is a misunderstanding about AI. And we've seen over the past several years, organizations and governments invest heavily in AI, maybe even misinvested in it because they misunderstand it. But we need to also acknowledge that AI is probably going to have the biggest impact on our lives, on our organizations, on the world than any other technology. I don't know if anybody can tell me who said this quote, "The nation that leads in AI will be the ruler of the world." This was actually, yes, exactly, it was Putin that said this quote. And I think he's right. Now, I have a problem with the concept of ruler and the concept of win. I think if one organization is winning, another one is losing. And I am worried about this. I'm worried that our economic model is driving us to think about maximizing GDP, maximizing profit, without concerning about ourselves about the impact on society. And I think I've tried to come up with a framework, but anybody that's done business, done a business degree, will be familiar with this framework. It's called PESTLE. It's a way of kind of analyzing macro trends. And many of you will have heard of one singularity, which is the technological singularity, which is when we create a superintelligence. Some of you might have heard of another type of singularity called the economic singularity, which was coined by a good friend of mine, Callum Chase, which is the point in time where AI automates the majority of human labor. Now, the concern is over the next 10, 20 years, we will free a lot of people up from their jobs, and our economies will not be ready to deal with that technological unemployment. I actually think there are 4 other singularities that we need to consider that are being driven by our economic impulses. So the political singularity is when we no longer know what is true. And this is the world of deep fakes and other technologies. Let me give you an example. There was a company recently that trained a machine learning model on the voice of a CEO. and they had the voice of the CEO call up the accounts department to pay for to pay an invoice. There will be a point in our future where we cannot determine what is true, and this will have impacts on our political systems and other things like that. A social singularity is when we cure death, and AI is going to enable us to understand how to what medical procedures to have, how to make ourselves live as long as possible. And there is a hypothesis that we will cure death within our lifetime, and that has lots of implications. There's of course the environmental singularity, which I've spelt wrong, which is when we create uncontrollable ecological collapse, again through probably our drive to increase consumption. And finally, the legal singularity is when surveillance becomes ubiquitous, which is when we can track everybody's digital footprint and we know everything about them. And again, we could talk a lot about these different macro singularities, but I just wanted to kind of highlight there a framework to think about some of the discussions that we're seeing in the news, in the media, and how they map to this framework. On the final note, and I'm going to close, is I don't think that governments are going to solve this problem. I actually think that companies are going to solve this problem. I think companies are going to realize if they want to attract talent, if they want to attract customers, it's not just about making profit. It's about being purposeful. And I think that the companies that are purposeful are the ones that are going to survive. And I hope that the purpose of those companies are going to be solving many of the problems that we're going to face in humanity over the next several decades. The purpose of Satalia is to enable a world where everybody's free to live beyond themselves. I believe that AI could create a world of abundance, a world where everybody is free to do whatever they want. And that's the world I want to create and work with people to create that world. I'm going to stop now, shut up, hand over to the panel.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dan. Absolutely mind-blowing as ever. I mean, curing death, super intelligences, what can I say? Thanks for such an insightful framework for discussing these kind of ethical considerations of AI systems. I think it's absolutely brilliant. Personally, I'm torn between living in perpetual fear of this malign AI singularity and kind of waiting for this utopian decentralized planet. So absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much.